Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time when you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1841, when the last leaves clung to the oak trees of Savannah, Georgia, a curious entry appeared in the personal ledger of Reverend Samuel Whitmore. The ink had faded over decades, but the words remained clear enough. Conducted private ceremony at Roland estate, no witnesses present. God forgive what I have done. This simple note, discovered in 1963 during the renovation of Christ Episcopal Church, would lead investigators down a path that uncovered one of Georgia's most disturbing stories of forbidden connection, family secrets, and the terrible price of crossing boundaries in antebellum society. The Roland family name carried significant weight in Savannah's mercantile circles. Thomas Roland had built a fortune in cotton and shipping, with a grand home on Abercorn Street and a reputation for shrewd business dealings. His daughter Catherine was, by all accounts from society papers of the time, considered a beauty of considerable charm and education, having studied in both Charleston and briefly in Philadelphia. What made the Roland family notable wasn't just their wealth, but their relatively recent acquisition of it. Thomas had arrived in Savannah in 1820 as a man of modest means, and within 15 years had established himself among the city's elite. Records from the Savannah Harbor Master's office show the Roland Shipping Company handled nearly 1/5 of all cotton exports by 1838. According to tax records from Chatham County, Thomas Roland owned 17 slaves by 1840, which placed him in the category of a mid-sized slaveholder by Georgia standards of the time. Most worked at his warehouses near the river or on a small plantation he maintained 20 miles outside the city. Among these individuals was a man listed in property records only as Elijah Male, age approximately 25 years, purchased 1836, Richmond, Virginia. What distinguished Elijah from other enslaved people in the Roland household was his position. Notations in Thomas Roland's business journals indicate that Elijah served as his personal assistant, accompanying him on business trips and handling correspondence. This arrangement wasn't entirely unusual for wealthy merchants of the period. What followed, however, defied all social conventions of the antebellum South. The first indication that something extraordinary occurred at the Roland household appears in the correspondence of Elizabeth Hartridge, wife of a prominent banker and neighbor to the Rolands. In a letter to her sister in Charleston, dated January 1842, she wrote, "There is the strangest air about the Roland house these days. The daughter no longer attends services or social gatherings. Thomas has dismissed 2 household servants without explanation and refuses all callers. Mary Preston claims to have seen Catherine walking in the garden after midnight, though I cannot imagine what would prompt such behavior in winter." The winter of 1841 to 1842 was particularly harsh in coastal Georgia. Newspaper accounts from the Savannah Republican describe unusually cold temperatures that caused the Savannah River to partially freeze in January, something that had not occurred in living memory. The isolation of the cold months may have provided cover for whatever transpired within the Roland household. Thomas Roland's business ledgers, preserved in the Georgia Historical Society archives, show an unusual pattern beginning in December 1841. Previously meticulous in his record-keeping, the entries became erratic. Large sums were withdrawn without explanation. A notation dated December 27th reads simply, "Payment to Whitmore, discretion required, $200. This sum, equivalent to nearly $6,000 today, represented an extraordinary payment to a clergyman. Reverend Samuel Whitmore served Christ Episcopal Church from 1835 until his death in 1852. Church records describe him as diligent in his duties, though troubled in spirit in his later years. His personal papers, discovered during the church renovation, include journal entries that suggest a man increasingly conflicted about the institution of slavery, though like many of his contemporaries, he never publicly advocated for abolition. The discovery of his cryptic note about the ceremony at the Roland estate prompted historians to examine his journals more closely. An entry dated December 23, 1841 reads, "Approached today by R, regarding a most unusual request. My conscience rebels against it, yet I find myself questioning whether refusing would prevent the act or merely drive it further into secrecy. If two souls are determined upon a course, perhaps it is better they receive some blessing than none at all. I shall pray for guidance." The next mention of the Rolands in Whitmore's journal comes on December 26th. "It is done. May God have mercy on all involved, myself included. The law of man and the customs of our society forbid it, yet I could not help but observe that their devotion appeared genuine. The consequences, should this be discovered, would be severe beyond measure." What exactly happened that night remains a subject of historical debate. No marriage certificate or formal record exists. However, the timing aligns with local rumors that began to circulate about Catherine Roland and an enslaved man on her father's property. These whispers never reached official documentation during their lifetime, but oral histories collected from descendants of Savannah families in the 1950s contain references to the merchant's daughter who married beneath her station and the Roland scandal that sent them west. The months following December 1841 brought dramatic changes to the Roland family. Property records show Thomas Roland sold his Savannah home in March 1842 for significantly less than its assessed value, suggesting a hasty transaction. Tax records indicate he liquidated most of his business holdings over the next 2 months. By June 1842, the Roland name disappears from Savannah's records entirely. The next documented appearance of Thomas Roland comes from a land purchase record in the Missouri Territory, dated September 1842. The record lists Thomas Roland and household as establishing a homestead near Independence. Missouri, a slave state but a frontier region at that time, offered the possibility of a fresh start away from Savannah society. Here, the official record grows dim. No census records clearly identify Catherine or Elijah in Missouri. However, a curious document emerged during research conducted by the Missouri Historical Society in 1967. A church registry from a small congregation near Independence lists a Catherine Brooks as a member beginning in 1843. No husband is listed alongside her, though 2 children are recorded as baptized in 1844 and 1847, respectively. The name Brooks carries particular significance when considered alongside a manumission document filed in Clay County, Missouri, in February 1843. The document, signed by Thomas Roland, grants freedom to "my slave Elijah," henceforth to be known as Elijah Brooks. The witness signature is partially damaged, but appears to match the handwriting of Reverend James Thornwell, the minister whose church Catherine Brooks attended. The connection between Catherine Roland and Catherine Brooks cannot be definitively established through official records. No marriage certificate exists for Catherine Brooks, and census records from the period are notoriously unreliable regarding women's identities, as they were often listed only under their husbands' names. However, the timing of Catherine Roland's disappearance from Georgia records and the appearance of Catherine Brooks in Missouri, combined with the unusual manumission of Elijah with the surname Brooks, suggests a remarkable possibility. Thomas Roland lived until 1859, according to cemetery records in Independence. His modest headstone stands in sharp contrast to the wealth he once commanded in Savannah. The Missouri probate records for his estate make no mention of Catherine, suggesting either estrangement or an arrangement made prior to his death to distance his assets from her. The absence itself speaks volumes in historical context. In 1856, Missouri census takers recorded a household outside Independence consisting of E. Brooks, colored, free, C. Brooks, white, and 3 children of mixed race. The census taker added a note: family lives isolated, minimal contact with neighbors. This brief entry provides a rare documented glimpse of what may have been Catherine and Elijah's life. Living on the frontier, they apparently established a household that, while not accepted by society, at least existed without the immediate threat of the severe legal penalties that would have faced them in Georgia. The trail grows colder after 1859. The outbreak of the Civil War disrupted record-keeping throughout Missouri, and many county documents from the period were destroyed during the border conflicts that ravaged the state. What became of Catherine, Elijah, and their children remains largely speculative. No death records clearly identifying them have been located. However, in 1959, a historian researching pre-Civil War free black communities discovered a remarkable letter in the collection of a historical society in Kansas. The letter, dated 1873, and written by a schoolteacher in a small settlement near Lawrence, described meeting an unusual couple, the wife being the daughter of a Georgia planter and the husband born into slavery. They have lived here quietly for nearly a decade, their grown children having moved further west. Few know their story, which they shared with me only after I had taught their grandchildren for 2 years and earned their trust. They speak of a ceremony performed in secret more than 30 years ago, which they consider a true marriage before God, if not recognized by any state. While the letter doesn't name the couple, the circumstances align with what is known about Catherine and Elijah. If this account is accurate, it suggests they ultimately found a measure of peace in Kansas, a state founded in the anti-slavery cause. The schoolteacher's letter continues. The woman still carries herself with the bearing of someone raised in privilege, though their home is simple. The man works as a carpenter of considerable skill. What struck me most was the evident devotion between them after so many years and hardships. When speaking of their early days, the woman said something I found quite moving, that crossing the river from Missouri to Kansas felt like finally leaving Egypt for the Promised Land. The reference to Egypt invokes biblical imagery that would have resonated deeply with many Americans of the era, particularly those who had experienced or witnessed the horrors of slavery. Kansas, despite its own complicated racial history, represented for many a territory associated with freedom in the years following the Civil War. The historical record falls silent on Catherine and Elijah after this point. No graves bearing their names have been identified. Their children, if the census record is accurate, would have been of mixed race and likely faced their own struggles in 19th century America. Whether they maintained their connection to their parents' story or chose to distance themselves from it remains unknown. In 1968, a doctoral student at Emory University attempted to trace descendants of Thomas Roland's family line as part of a broader study on wealth distribution before and after the Civil War. His notes indicate that he identified several individuals who may have been great-grandchildren of Catherine and Elijah living in California, but ethical concerns about privacy prevented him from making direct contact. His research notes contain the cryptic comment, "Family oral tradition apparently preserved some knowledge of ancestors from Georgia and Missouri, but details have blurred across generations." Some resistance to discussing the matter suggests continued sensitivity around the circumstances. The Roland home in Savannah no longer stands. It was demolished in 1912 to make way for commercial development. No known photographs of Catherine or Elijah exist, though the Georgia Historical Society does possess a damaged daguerreotype labeled Roland Family circa 1840 that shows Thomas Roland and what appears to be a young woman presumably Catherine. The image quality is too poor to discern detailed features, leaving her face, like much of her story, shrouded in uncertainty. Reverend Whitmore's grave in the Christchurch Cemetery bears a simple inscription: "He served God according to his conscience." Whether this refers to his general ministry or specifically to his decision to perform a ceremony forbidden by the laws and customs of his time, we cannot know. His journals, which might have contained more details about the ceremony and his reasoning, were heavily damaged by water when the church basement flooded in 1951. Many pages from the crucial period of December 1841 are illegible or missing entirely. What remains are fragments, a notation in a ledger, property records, census entries, letters, oral histories, that together suggest an extraordinary story of two people who defied the rigid racial boundaries of their time. The consequences they faced, while not fully documented, certainly included exile, isolation, and the surrender of privilege and position. Yet the schoolteacher's letter from Kansas hints that they maintained their commitment to each other despite these hardships. The human tendency when encountering such fragmentary evidence is to construct a narrative that makes sense of it, perhaps imposing a romantic interpretation on what might have been a more complicated reality. We cannot know the true nature of Catherine and Elijah's relationship, whether it represented genuine devotion, as the schoolteacher believed, or involved elements of coercion inherent in the power dynamics of slavery. The absence of their own written accounts leaves this central question unresolved. What we do know is that their story unfolded against the backdrop of one of the most rigid social systems in American history, in which relationships across racial lines were not merely discouraged, but criminalized. Georgia law in 1841 not only prohibited marriage between white and black individuals, but imposed severe penalties on any white woman who had children with a black man. These laws reflected the determination of white Southern society to maintain racial hierarchy and prevent any blurring of the line between enslaved and free. In this context, the decision of a wealthy merchant's daughter and an enslaved man to seek some form of marital blessing, if indeed that is what occurred in the Roland household on that December night, represented an extraordinary rejection of social norms. The fact that they apparently received this blessing from an Episcopal minister adds another layer of complexity to the story, suggesting that even within institutions that generally supported the status quo, individuals sometimes acted according to personal conscience. The Reverend Whitmore's journal entry, "It is done, may God have mercy on all involved," evokes both the gravity of his action and his awareness of potential consequences. His acceptance of a large payment raises questions about his motivations, yet his evident distress in subsequent entries suggests genuine moral conflict rather than simple venality. Thomas Roland's role in the story presents perhaps the greatest puzzle. Did he arrange his daughter's escape to Missouri with his former slave as an act of paternal compassion, recognizing a genuine attachment? Or was his primary concern containing a scandal that threatened his social standing? The sale of his Savannah properties at below-market rates suggests urgency, while his establishment of a new homestead in Missouri indicates planning. The manumission of Elijah, a significant financial sacrifice, points towards some degree of acceptance, yet the absence of Catherine from his will suggests ongoing ambivalence or perhaps a strategic decision to protect assets. The fragmentary nature of the evidence allows for multiple interpretations, each reflecting different assumptions about human behavior and historical context. Perhaps this ambiguity is fitting for a story that defied the binary thinking of its time, a story that occurred in the gray area between what society permitted and what individuals desired. In the decades since the discovery of Reverend Whitmore's cryptic ledger entry, several novelists and playwrights have attempted to fill in the gaps of Catherine and Elijah's story. These fictional treatments typically emphasize themes of forbidden love and sacrifice, casting the couple as tragic heroes who challenge the injustices of their era. While such works may capture emotional truths, historians remain cautious about asserting more than the limited evidence allows. What cannot be disputed is that Catherine Roland vanished from Savannah society at the age of 22, that her father suddenly relocated to Missouri, that an enslaved man named Elijah received unusual manumission with the surname Brooks, and that a white woman named Catherine Brooks appeared in Missouri records shortly thereafter. The conjunction of these facts strongly suggests a connection that violated the strict racial boundaries of antebellum America. The historical significance of their story lies not in its uniqueness. Other cases of relationships across racial lines certainly occurred throughout American history, but in the unusual degree to which it can be traced through historical records, offering a glimpse into how individuals navigated and sometimes defied the rigid social structures of their time. For modern Americans, the story of Catherine and Elijah exists at the intersection of personal choice and systemic oppression, raising questions about agency, consent, and resistance that continue to resonate. What appears in fragmentary historical records as a possible love story unfolded within a context of profound inequality, complicating any simple romantic interpretation. The silence that surrounds much of their story reflects both the deliberate obscurity they sought and the systematic erasure of such relationships from official narratives. That we know of them at all is largely due to the chance survival of a minister's ledger entry, a neighbor's gossip, tax records, and a schoolteacher's letter, tangential documents that collectively outline a shadow history running counter to the authorized version of antebellum Southern society. In 1897, during construction work near the former site of the Roland warehouse in Savannah, workers discovered a small tin box buried beneath the floorboards. Inside was a woman's gold locket containing a braid of hair, black and brown strands woven together, and a scrap of paper bearing only the initials CR and EB and a date, December 26, 1841. The artifacts were donated to the Georgia Historical Society, where they remained largely unremarked until the discovery of Reverend Whitmore's ledger in 1963 connected them to the Roland story. The locket now rests in an archived drawer, a tangible but enigmatic link to two people who lived beyond the boundaries their society prescribed, leaving behind only traces for future generations to discover. Like so many stories from the past, theirs remains incomplete, a narrative assembled from fragments, with gaps that invite both scholarly caution and human curiosity. Perhaps somewhere, descendants of Catherine and Elijah carry some memory of their story, passed down through generations as a family legend of ancestors who chose a difficult path. Or perhaps their story ended in Kansas, the details of their early days in Georgia gradually fading from family memory as their children and grandchildren focused on building lives in a changing America. What echoes across the decades is the profound silence that surrounds their choice, a silence born of necessity in their lifetime and perpetuated by the incomplete nature of the historical record. That silence itself speaks to the power of the boundaries they crossed and the consequences they faced for doing so. In the end, the story of Catherine Roland and Elijah Brooks remains a whisper from the past, heard only in fragments. Their lives, whatever they contained of joy or sorrow, love or regret, continue to exist in that liminal space between documented history and the vast realm of human experience that leaves no record. We know enough to recognize the extraordinary nature of their choice and its defiance of their society's strictest taboo, but not enough to fully understand the complex humanity behind that choice. Perhaps that is as it should be. A reminder of the limitations of historical knowledge and the privacy that belongs, even in retrospect, to two people who sought to live beyond the constraints of their time and place, leaving behind just enough traces for us to wonder at their courage. In 1954, an elderly woman arrived at the Missouri Historical Society with a small wooden box. According to the accession records, she identified herself as Margaret Wilson, a retired school teacher from California. She claimed to be the great-granddaughter of Catherine Brooks and wished to donate several family items she believed had historical significance. The archivist who received the donation noted that Mrs. Wilson appeared reluctant to discuss specific details about her ancestors, but insisted that the items should be preserved because they tell a truth that needed to be remembered. The wooden box contained 3 items: a worn Bible with family birth and death dates inscribed on the frontispiece, a hand-stitched quilt patch bearing the embroidered initials CR and EB, and most significantly, a letter dated April 1878. The letter, written in a careful hand on fragile paper, was addressed simply to "my children and their children after them." The signature at the bottom reads, "Catherine Roland Brooks." The Missouri Historical Society kept the letter in their restricted archives due to its fragile condition, and it wasn't until 1965 that it was properly conserved and transcribed. The authenticity of the document has been debated among historians, with some questioning whether it might be a later fabrication. However, paper analysis and handwriting comparison with known samples from the period support its authenticity. The letter itself is remarkable for what it reveals and what it withholds. Catherine writes, "I have never recorded the full account of my departure from Savannah, as such knowledge could bring harm to those I love even decades later. But as I feel the approach of my final years, I wish to leave some truth for those who come after, so they might understand the choices that shaped their lineage." She continues, "Know that I left my father's house by choice, abandoning privilege for something I deemed of greater worth. The man whom society declared my father's property, I declared my equal and my chosen companion. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." These words were spoken over us by a minister who risked much to follow his conscience rather than the laws of Georgia. My father's rage upon discovery was terrible, yet in time he found he could not entirely cast off his daughter. It was he who arranged our passage to Missouri, though I believe this was as much to protect the family name as from any tender feeling toward me. The letter makes reference to the difficulties the couple faced. "Even here in the West, we have lived carefully. Elijah's skill as a carpenter has provided our living, though he has often been paid less than his work deserved. I have taught our children letters and figures at home, as the schools would not accept them. We have known the pain of neighbors' doors closed to us, of church pews suddenly reserved, of whispered comments that fall silent upon our approach. Yet I have never regretted the path we chose." Most poignantly, Catherine addresses the future. "To my children and theirs, you carry in your blood 2 streams that this nation has declared cannot mix. There may come a time when you find it easier to claim one ancestry and deny the other. I cannot judge what choices you will make to survive in this world that sees in stark black and white what is in truth infinite shades. But know this: your father was a man of dignity, intelligence, and gentle strength who taught himself to read by candlelight after exhausting days of labor. And if there is any grace or learning in me, it came not from my privileged upbringing, but from the humility I learned walking beside him through this life." The letter concludes, "We will soon rest beneath Kansas soil, far from both Georgia's heat and Missouri's troubled border. What became of the reverend who married us, or my father in his final years, I cannot say. The past recedes like the wake behind a ship, visible for a time, then vanishing into the greater sea. But love endures beyond the grave. This, I believe. This remarkable document provides the only known first-person account from either Catherine or Elijah. Its measured tone and careful omission of certain details suggest a woman well aware of the potential consequences of her words, even decades after the events they describe. The Bible donated alongside the letter contains family records that indicate Elijah Brooks died in 1874 at approximately 59 years of age. Catherine survived him by several years, passing in 1881 at age 62. According to the inscriptions, they had 3 children who survived to adulthood: Thomas, born 1844, Mary, born 1847, and Samuel, born 1851. The names themselves tell a story. Thomas, perhaps named for Catherine's father, suggesting some reconciliation or at least acknowledgement of that relationship. Samuel, possibly honoring the minister who performed their ceremony. The fate of these children encapsulates the complexity of racial identity in post-Civil War America. The Bible records indicate that Thomas Brooks married a woman named Sarah Johnson in 1871 and moved to California during the population boom following the Transcontinental Railroad's completion. His death is recorded in San Francisco in 1910. Mary's entry shows marriage to James Wilson, described as a school teacher of color, with their residence listed as Lawrence, Kansas. Samuel's life appears to have been briefer. The Bible records his death in 1879 at age 28, with no mention of marriage or children. Margaret Wilson, the woman who donated the items, would have been Mary's granddaughter, according to the family lineage. Her reluctance to discuss her ancestors in detail with the Missouri archivist reflects the continuing sensitivity around mixed-race heritage even in the mid-20th century. That she chose to donate the family items to a historical society, however, suggests a desire for some aspect of the story to be preserved. In 1967, Dr. Eleanor Martindale, a historian researching antebellum interracial relationships, attempted to locate and interview Margaret Wilson. Her research notes indicate that she tracked Wilson to an address in Oakland, California, but found that she had passed away in 1966. Neighbors described her as a very private person who had lived alone and rarely spoke of her family background. One mentioned that Wilson had been a respected elementary school teacher for over 30 years. The fragmented trail of Catherine and Elijah's descendants illustrates the various strategies adopted by mixed-race Americans navigating a society obsessed with racial categorization. Some, like Thomas, who moved to California, may have sought locations where their family history would be less scrutinized. Others, like Mary, who married a man identified as of color, embraced a black identity. The donation of family papers generations later represents yet another strategy, a careful unveiling of history on the family's own terms. In 1959, during the renovation of an old carpentry workshop near Lawrence, Kansas, workers discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards containing a small leather pouch. Inside were 2 items: a hand-carved wooden pendant in the shape of a bird in flight, and a folded paper containing pressed flowers. The paper bore a single line in faded ink. From the garden where we first spoke, Savannah, 1839. No names were included, but the location of the workshop aligns with property records showing ownership by an E. Brooks from 1863 to 1874. These small personal artifacts provide a glimpse into the emotional dimension of Catherine and Elijah's story that formal records cannot capture. The pressed flowers, presumably carried from Georgia to Missouri and finally to Kansas, suggest a sentimental attachment to the place where their relationship began, despite the danger and oppression they experienced there. The carved bird may represent their journey toward freedom, though such interpretations remain speculative. In 1870, as Reconstruction policies attempted to reshape Southern society, a census taker in Chatham County, Georgia, recorded an interview with an elderly former slave named Isaiah, who had once worked on the Roland estate. The margins of the census form contain a notation. Subject volunteered story about master's daughter who married a colored man and was disowned. Claims they fled to the West. Account seems unreliable, not recorded in official tally. This dismissive treatment by the census taker typifies the erasure of such relationships from official narratives, relegating them to marginalia and rumor. Yet the story persisted in various forms. In 1942, a folklore collection project recorded an oral history from an 89-year-old black woman in Savannah who recounted a story passed down in her family about a white lady who loved a slave man so much she gave up everything to go with him when freedom came. While the timeline in this account doesn't match Catherine and Elijah's departure before the Civil War, the core narrative shows how such stories were preserved in community memory, often with details altered through retelling. The historical neglect of relationships like Catherine and Elijah's reflects more than just the scarcity of records. Until relatively recently, such stories were considered peripheral to mainstream historical narratives, embarrassing reminders of the contradictions within a society that simultaneously maintained rigid racial boundaries while human connections inevitably crossed those boundaries. Academic historians often dismissed such accounts as exceptional cases or romanticized legends rather than meaningful parts of the historical record. This perspective began to shift in the 1960s and 70s as scholars increasingly recognized the importance of recovering marginalized histories. The discovery of Reverend Whitmore's ledger entry in 1963 coincided with this broader re-evaluation, prompting renewed interest in the fragmentary evidence surrounding Catherine and Elijah's story. What might once have been dismissed as mere scandal or footnote came to be seen as a window into the complex reality of race relations in the antebellum period. Dr. Martindale's 1971 article in the Journal of Southern History, The Merchant's Daughter and the Boundaries of Race, represented one of the first scholarly attempts to analyze the available evidence about Catherine and Elijah within the context of broader historical patterns. She argued that their story, while certainly unusual, was not as exceptional as previous historians had suggested. Rather, it represented one documented instance of a phenomenon that likely occurred more frequently than official records indicate, particularly in urban settings where enslaved and free people had greater opportunities for interaction. Martindale noted the significance of Savannah as the setting for the early part of their story. As a busy port city with a substantial free black population alongside enslaved workers, Savannah offered more fluid social spaces than rural plantations. Thomas Roland's position as a merchant rather than a planter placed his household in this more dynamic urban context, where his business activities required the movement of enslaved workers like Elijah through various social settings. The historical record suggests that Elijah occupied an unusual position within the Roland household. Thomas Roland's business journals contain multiple entries indicating that Elijah handled correspondence and accompanied him on business trips, roles that required literacy and a degree of independence rare among enslaved people. An entry from 1839 notes, E. dispatched to Charleston with contracts for Harrington shipment. Returns Thursday with signatures. Such responsibilities would have distinguished Elijah from other enslaved individuals and potentially placed him in more regular contact with Catherine. The circumstances of their first meeting and the development of their relationship remain largely speculative. Catherine's letter to her children mentions the garden where we first spoke, suggesting perhaps a private conversation in the grounds of the Roland home. The pressed flowers preserved from this location hint at an emotional significance attached to this initial encounter. What words passed between them and how their connection evolved from that point remains unrecorded. What is clear is that by December 1841, their relationship had developed to the point that they sought some form of marital blessing, despite the enormous risks involved. Reverend Whitmore's acceptance of their request, however reluctant, represents a remarkable breach of social and legal norms. Georgia law at the time prescribed severe penalties for any minister who performed an interracial marriage ceremony, including fine and imprisonment. Whitmore's willingness to proceed despite these risks suggests either extraordinary compassion or extraordinary venality, perhaps some measure of both. The payment of $200, recorded in Thomas Roland's ledger, raises particular questions. Was this a bribe to ensure Whitmore's silence, a fee for services rendered, or perhaps, as some historians have suggested, funds provided to assist the couple's planned departure from Georgia? The large sum, equivalent to several years' wages for an average worker, indicates the gravity of the transaction, whatever its specific purpose. The ceremony itself remains shrouded in mystery. Whitmore's journal describes it only as done, without elaborating on the ritual performed or words spoken. Did he use the traditional Episcopal marriage service, with its solemn vows and invocation of divine blessing? Or did he create some modified ceremony that might allow him to later deny having performed an actual marriage? The description of no witnesses present suggests an awareness of the legal implications and perhaps a deliberate choice to minimize the number of people who could testify to what occurred. The immediate aftermath appears to have brought discovery and crisis. While no direct account exists, the timing of Thomas Roland's property sales and hasty departure from Savannah suggests a rapid unraveling of the family's position. Elizabeth Hartridge's letter, noting Catherine's absence from social functions and Thomas's dismissal of household servants, indicates disruption within the household, possibly following discovery of the relationship or the ceremony. The journey from Georgia to Missouri would have been arduous under the best circumstances, involving weeks of travel by river and road. For Catherine and Elijah, the dangers would have been compounded by the legal and social risks of traveling together. An unmarried white woman and a black man, likely still legally enslaved during the journey, would have attracted dangerous attention throughout the South. How they managed this journey and what assistance they received remains one of the most significant gaps in the historical record. Missouri, their chosen destination, occupied a complex position in the antebellum landscape. As a slave state bordering free territory, it represented a frontier where social structures were somewhat less rigid than in the established South, while still providing legal framework for Thomas Roland to maintain ownership of Elijah until choosing to grant manumission. The timing of this manumission in February 1843, relatively soon after their arrival, suggests some prearrangement rather than a gradual change of heart. The life Catherine and Elijah built in Missouri emerges only in glimpses through the historical record. The census notation describing them as living isolated, minimal contact with neighbors suggests a strategy of deliberate seclusion, perhaps to avoid the hostility their relationship would have provoked. Catherine's letter references Elijah's work as a carpenter, indicating that he established an independent livelihood, while her mention of teaching their children at home points to the barriers they faced in accessing public institutions. Their eventual move to Kansas, following the Civil War, placed them in a state founded in the anti-slavery cause, though this did not necessarily translate to social acceptance of interracial marriage. Kansas had been the site of significant violence during the Bleeding Kansas period of the 1850s, when pro- and anti-slavery forces clashed over the territory's future. By the time Catherine and Elijah arrived, Kansas had entered the Union as a free state, but racial attitudes remained complex and often hostile. The schoolteacher's 1873 letter describing the couple in Kansas provides one of the few external perspectives on their later life together. The description of Catherine still carrying the bearing of someone raised in privilege suggests that certain aspects of her early upbringing remained visible decades later. The observation about their evident devotion after many years and hardships offers a rare emotional insight into the endurance of their relationship despite the immense social pressure against it. Catherine's letter to her children, with its measured tone and careful omissions, reveals a woman reflective about the choices that shaped her life. Her description of leaving privilege for something I deemed of greater worth points to a conscious decision rather than impulsive action. The acknowledgement that her father's assistance in their escape may have been as much to protect the family name as from any tender feeling shows her clear-eyed assessment of complex family dynamics. Most striking is her direct address to future generations about their mixed heritage and the difficult choices they might face in a society fixated on racial categorization. The subsequent generations of the family, as glimpsed through the Bible records and Margaret Wilson's donation, illustrate the continuing impact of Catherine and Elijah's decision across time. Their children and grandchildren navigated a post-Civil War America that, despite legal emancipation, maintained rigid racial hierarchies through both law and custom. The different paths taken by their children, Thomas to California, Mary remaining in Kansas, Samuel's early death, reflect the limited options available to those of mixed race in this period. Margaret Wilson's decision to donate the family items to the Missouri Historical Society in 1954 occurred against the backdrop of the early civil rights movement. Her choice to preserve these records while maintaining personal privacy about her ancestry suggests both pride in her family history and awareness of the continuing sensitivity surrounding interracial heritage. That she identified herself as Catherine's great-granddaughter, rather than concealing this connection entirely, represents its own form of courage in the mid-20th century. The historical significance of Catherine and Elijah's story extends beyond their personal journey. Their experience illuminates the contradictions at the heart of antebellum Southern society, a system that simultaneously denied the humanity of enslaved people while being unable to prevent human connections that crossed its rigid boundaries. The defiance of these boundaries, whatever personal motivations drove it, represented a fundamental challenge to the ideological foundations of slavery and racial hierarchy. The fragmented nature of their historical trail, a minister's cryptic note, tax records, census entries, family artifacts, oral histories, exemplifies the methodological challenges facing historians of marginalized groups. The most significant events often leave the faintest traces in the official record, requiring careful interpretation of what remains while acknowledging the vast silences that cannot be filled. For contemporary audiences, the story of Catherine and Elijah offers neither simple romance nor straightforward moral lesson. Their relationship unfolded within a context of profound inequality, raising questions about consent and power that cannot be definitively resolved. Yet Catherine's letter, if authentic, asserts her agency in choosing this path and her lifelong commitment to it, despite the hardships that followed. Perhaps what resonates most from these fragments across the centuries is the persistence with which Catherine and Elijah forged a life together despite overwhelming obstacles. From Savannah to Missouri to Kansas, they created a family and built a home in a society that denied the legitimacy of both. The pressed flowers carried from Georgia, the carved wooden bird, the braided lock of hair, these intimate artifacts speak to the human capacity for connection, even within systems designed to prevent it. In 1969, the Georgia Historical Society mounted a small exhibition titled Savannah's Hidden Histories, featuring the locket containing the braided hair alongside transcriptions of the relevant documents. The exhibition text noted, "The story of Catherine Roland and Elijah Brooks remains incomplete, known only through fragments and traces. Yet these fragments invite us to reconsider our understanding of antebellum society and to recognize the individuals who lived beyond its boundaries, however precariously. Today, no monument marks their journey from Georgia to the Kansas prairie. Their graves, if they exist, have not been identified by historians. Yet their story persists, a whisper from the margins of American history, challenging simplistic narratives and reminding us of the complex humanity that existed within even the most rigid social systems. As Catherine wrote to her children, "The past recedes like the wake behind a ship, visible for a time then vanishing into the greater sea. But love endures beyond the grave. This, I believe,